I didn't plan on shutting down an entire neighborhood. I just wanted my kids to ride their bikes without being treated like criminals. But sometimes, people push you into corners and then act surprised when you start looking for exits they didn't think about. So yeah, 2 weeks of darkness. That's what it took for them to remember what common sense looks like. It started on a quiet Tuesday evening, golden hour kind of light. You know the type. The air's warm, not too humid. Kids laughing in the background like everything's exactly how it should be. My twins, Eli and Nora, were out front, wobbling a little but determined. First time without training wheels, and man, you could see it in their faces, that mix of fear and pride, like they were about to conquer the world, or at least the sidewalk in front of our house. And I was just standing there, coffee in hand, watching them, thinking, this is it. This is one of those moments you don't get back. And then, of course, here comes Leonard. Leonard Briggs, HOA treasurer, walking across the street like he owns the oxygen we're all breathing, clipboard tucked under his arm like it's some kind of weapon, jaw tight, eyes already judging. You ever meet someone who doesn't just follow rules, they need rules, like it gives their life structure or something? Yeah, that's Leonard. He didn't even say hello, just cleared his throat real loud like we were in a courtroom. Sir, I'm gonna need you to have your children stop riding bicycles on the sidewalk immediately. Just like that, no warmth, no hesitation, my kids froze. Eli literally stopped mid-pedal, looked at me like, did I do something wrong? And I felt that shift in my chest. You know that feeling when something small suddenly isn't small anymore. I said, they're just learning. Man, they're 8. And Leonard, without missing a beat, pulls out this laminated sheet, like he's been waiting his whole life for this moment. HOA Regulation 22B clearly states that sidewalks are designated for pedestrian use only. Bicycles present liability risks and may cause surface damage. Surface damage. I actually laughed at that. I couldn't help it. Surface damage? They weigh like 50 pounds combined. But he didn't laugh. Not even a little. Just tightened his grip on that clipboard. These are private walkways maintained by association dues. You'll need to find an alternative location. Alternative location. Yeah, sure, let me just teleport my kids to the nearest park 2 miles away every evening after work. I could feel the frustration building. But what hit harder was turning around and seeing Nora quietly step off her bike, like she'd already accepted she wasn't allowed to have this moment anymore. That's the part that sticks with you. Leonard kept going, listing complaints, tire marks, potential accidents, homeowner concerns, like he was reading off a grocery list of reasons kids shouldn't be kids. And then he dropped the line that really told me everything I needed to know. The board voted unanimously. Oh, of course they did, because nothing says community like a group of adults sitting in a room deciding that 8-year-olds are a liability. I didn't argue anymore, not out there, not in front of my kids. I just nodded, told them to bring the bikes inside. But inside my head, something had already shifted, because here's the thing about people like Leonard. They assume power only flows one way. They assume rules are something they hand down, not something that can come back around. And that night, sitting in my backyard, staring at my old tool shed, I remembered something Leonard clearly forgot. 3 years ago, when the HOA upgraded the entire neighborhood to those fancy LED streetlights, they ran into a little problem. They needed a central place for the control box, somewhere accessible, somewhere safe. And my shed, right in the middle of the development, was perfect, and I said yes. No contracts, no fees, just trying to be a good neighbor. Funny how that works out. Because suddenly I realized I wasn't just storing my lawn equipment in that shed. I was hosting the switch that controlled every single streetlight in this entire neighborhood. And Leonard, he had no idea. Now let me pause the story for a second, because this right here, this is where things get interesting, not just emotionally, but structurally. Because a lot of people hear HOA and think it's just some annoying neighborhood committee, but it's actually way more layered than that. According to standard procedure, HOAs operate like mini-governments. They enforce covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and AMP, RS. And once you buy into that neighborhood, you're agreeing to play by those rules whether you like them or not. But here's the catch most people don't think about. Those rules are only as strong as their enforcement and their consistency. The moment enforcement becomes selective or unreasonable, you open the door to pushback. And from a legal perspective, Leonard wasn't entirely wrong. HOAs can regulate common areas like sidewalks if they're privately maintained, but banning children from riding bikes altogether? That starts drifting into what we call overreach, especially if there's no reasonable alternative provided. And that's where things shift from policy into psychology, because this wasn't really about safety or concrete damage. This is a psychological trap. People in positions like Leonard's often develop what's called authority bias reinforcement, meaning the more they enforce rules, the more they feel validated. And the stricter they become over time, it stops being about the rule and starts being about control. And when someone like that meets resistance, or worse, quiet compliance, they double down, because backing off feels like losing status. Now here's the part Leonard completely overlooked. Power in these communities isn't just written in bylaws. It's also embedded in infrastructure, in dependencies, in who actually enables the system to function. And in this case, that was me. So the next evening, I walked out to that shed, same one I'd barely thought about for months, pulled the door open, and there it was. The control panel, clean, labeled, almost too easy, a single main breaker marked community lighting grid. And I just stood there for a second, hand hovering over it. Because let's be honest, this wasn't just flipping a switch, this was crossing a line. But then I pictured Nora stepping off her bike again, that quiet little defeat, and something in me just went, no, not this time, so I flipped it. And just like that, the entire neighborhood went dark, not dim, not flickering. Gone, street after street swallowed in shadow like someone pulled the plug on a movie set. And I'll admit, there was a moment, just a small one, where I thought, okay, maybe I just made this way bigger than it needed to be. But then I closed the shed, walked back inside, and didn't touch that breaker again. Day one was quiet, confused, but quiet. People thought it was a glitch, maybe a transformer issue, something the utility company would fix overnight. Day two, different story. I'm sitting on the porch, watching neighbors walk their dogs with phone flashlights, slow, cautious, like they're navigating a cave instead of their own street. You could hear it in their voices too. That edge, annoyance turning into concern. Someone down the block twisted their ankle stepping off an uneven curb they couldn't see. Nothing major, but enough to shake that sense of comfort. Day three, my phone rings. Leonard, of course. We've contacted the power company. They're saying the system is offline, but there's no external outage. I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching Eli and Nora riding circles in the garage, bright overhead lights, laughing like nothing had changed. Huh, that's strange, I said, keeping my voice level. Maybe it's internal. You could hear the tension on his end, like he was trying to piece together something that didn't quite fit. Day five, things escalated. Someone backing out of their driveway clipped a mailbox. Again, nothing catastrophic, but the kind of thing that adds pressure, stacks frustration on top of inconvenience. And now people are talking, not casually, but in those tight little circles where complaints start turning into blame. Day seven. That's when it tipped. Delivery driver. Got lost, couldn't read house numbers, ended up driving straight through a flower bed, and suddenly this wasn't just annoying, it was costing people money. That same day, they brought in an electrical contractor. Guy knew what he was doing, methodical, traced the issue step by step until it led exactly where it had to lead my shed. I saw him walking up the driveway before he even knocked, toolbox in hand, already halfway to the answer. I opened the door, gave him a polite nod, and before he could even start, I said, I'm gonna have to stop you right there. He blinked, caught off guard. Excuse me. I kept it calm, measured. That equipment hasn't been inspected recently, and I'm not comfortable allowing access without proper city permits. Liability concerns. You should have seen his face. Half confusion, half realization, because he knew. He knew this just got complicated. How long would that take, he asked. I shrugged. Cities backed up, could be weeks. And that was the moment the balance shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but decisively, because now the problem wasn't technical anymore. It was procedural, and procedures, they take time. Later that afternoon, I'm out in the driveway, teaching Eli how to lift his front wheel just a little, tiny wheelies, nothing crazy, when I see them coming. Leonard, and not just Leonard, the whole board, president, secretary, even the guy who never talks at meetings, all walking together like a group that finally realized they're not in control of the situation anymore. Leonard didn't have the clipboard this time. That was the first thing I noticed. His shoulders were lower too, tension replaced with something closer to reluctance. "We need to talk," he said. I leaned back against the car, wiped my hands on a rag. "About what?" The board president stepped forward, holding a folder, official, prepared, but there was a softness to it now. "We've reviewed Regulation 22B, she said, careful with her words. "And we've decided to rescind it, effective immediately. Children's bicycles are now permitted on all community walkways." I didn't say anything right away, just glanced over at my kids, who were pretending not to listen but absolutely listening. Nora's face lit up before she could even stop it. Eli looked like he just won something he didn't fully understand. Leonard cleared his throat, like the next part physically hurt. "We'll also be installing children at play signage throughout the neighborhood." And then, the part that really sealed it. "And we'd like to offer a monthly compensation of $150 for hosting the electrical infrastructure on your property." There it was, acknowledgement, not just of inconvenience, but of dependency. I let the silence sit for a second longer than necessary. Not to be dramatic, just to make sure they felt it. Then I nodded. "Sounds reasonable." No gloating, no speech, just that. Because honestly, at that point, the message had already landed that evening. Just as the sun dipped low again, I walked back to the shed, opened the panel, and flipped the breaker back on. One click, and like that, the neighborhood lit up, street by street, warm pools of light returning like nothing ever happened. Except everything had changed. You could hear it too. Faint at first, then building. A collective exhale, doors opening, voices carrying, relief settling in, and the next morning, my kids were back on their bikes, right there on the sidewalk, exactly where they should have been all along. So yeah, that's how a simple no bikes on the sidewalk rule turned into a 2-week blackout, and a very uncomfortable lesson for an entire HOA board. And before anyone jumps in with "that was petty," or "you escalated too far," maybe, but let's unpack it a little, because this isn't really about revenge, it's about balance. It's about what happens when authority forgets its purpose. The lesson here is, rules are supposed to serve the community, not suffocate it. And the moment they stop making sense in real life, especially for something as basic as kids learning to ride a bike, that's when people start pushing back, sometimes quietly, sometimes creatively. Now from a legal perspective, what I did was walking a very fine line. I didn't damage anything. I didn't tamper with equipment illegally. I simply exercised control over something that was physically on my property. But intent matters. And if this had gone further, serious injuries, emergency situations, things could have gotten complicated real fast. That's the part people don't always see when they cheer for stories like this. There's risk on both sides. But here's where it gets deeper. Because this wasn't just a legal standoff, it was a psychological one, remember? What I said earlier, this is a psychological trap. Leonard didn't start out as the bad guy. He became that over time, reinforced by a system that rewarded strict enforcement over human judgment. And when no one challenged him, that behavior calcified. It became identity, authority for the sake of authority. And that happens everywhere, not just HOAs. Workplaces, schools, even families, small unchecked power turning into rigid control. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most people comply, not because they agree, but because it's easier. Easier to keep the peace, easier to avoid conflict, easier to tell your kids, just deal with it. But every now and then, someone decides not to, not loudly, not recklessly, but strategically. And that's the difference. Because this wasn't about yelling at Leonard in the street or filing complaints that go nowhere. This was about understanding the system better than the people enforcing it, identifying leverage, and using it in a way that forces a conversation, not asks for one. According to standard procedure, HOAs rely heavily on resident compliance. They don't have unlimited enforcement power. They depend on people playing along. And when that breaks, even slightly, the whole structure starts to wobble. And that's exactly what happened here. Not because I won, but because the system had to correct itself to function again. Now would I recommend everyone go out and start flipping breakers? Obviously not. That's not the takeaway. The takeaway is awareness. Understanding where real power sits in any situation. Sometimes it's in contracts. Sometimes it's in relationships. And sometimes, like in this case, it's sitting quietly in a shed no one thinks about. And if you don't recognize it, someone else will. So here's the question I want to leave you with. If you were in that position, your kids, your neighborhood, your HOA, would you have let it go? Kept the bikes in the garage, driven 2 miles to the park every evening, told yourself it's not worth the trouble? Or would you have found your own version of the breaker switch and reminded them that community goes both ways? Drop your answer in the comments, because I guarantee there's more people dealing with this kind of thing than you think. And trust me, some of them are a lot closer to their own switch than anyone realizes.